I have to say right off the bat that the gentle waterfall sound behind in the background is the noise of my Surface Pro working very hard doing a webinar. So I apologize for that. I've got a workaround. As soon as the little Google drone can fly to my house and drop off a microphone, I don't think it'll happen in the next hour or so, so bear with me, please. So if can you see a green screen that says sharing your story in a way that inspires? That's what we're talking about today. Talking about how to tell a budget, how to tell the story of our budget in a better way than columns of numbers, and we can do this. So a quick bit about me. I'm one of those very weird people who would study math and then study theology. When I did my doctorate in ministry at Tyndale a few years ago, I researched Christian giving. And when I use quotes from people in this presentation, they are quotes from the research that I did, actual people sitting in a church basement and Laurie taking notes and recording. If you're interested in knowing more about that, it's all on my website. So I'm a fundraising consultant. I look at data. I'm a theologian, a poet, a donor, a board member. Probably most importantly for this particular audience, I'm a former pastor and a current wife and mom. This presentation is pretty much completely taken from work that I did earlier this year. I was in Washington, D.C. On the 99th day of the Trump presidency. So I have some really interesting memories of doing this workshop. They were setting up the porta potties on Pennsylvania Avenue for the protesters on day 100. So I have a really strong emotional reaction to where and when I was when I first did this workshop. So sharing your story in a way that inspires, or a subheading could be narrative budgets, finding and telling your church's mission story. And I am confident, 100% sure, well, that sounds like Trump, I'm confident that you have a story to tell, large or small, whatever the size of your congregation, you have a story to tell. I want to do just one little whoa, and that is if you yourself don't give, you have some hard work to do first before you would want to get involved in a project like narrative budgeting. That might sound obvious, but I just want to put it out there that sometimes the place where the work has to start with ourselves, and that's okay. So what we're going to do this session is three things. We're going to talk about church budgets, the good, the bad, and the ugly. We're going to talk about finding your church's mission story. And as I say, I'm confident that your church does have a mission story that you can tell. And then how to tell that story, or even better, how to show that story, because a picture really is worth 1,000 words. So as Janice and Karen have already mentioned, please type in your questions, and then there'll be several breaks during the presentation and at the end where Karen and Janice will read out those questions on your behalf. So church budget, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Let's start with the good, shall we? The good thing is that national research, and then I used the same question in my own research, and it found the same thing, that churchgoers, people who attend churches, generally trust their church, and by this I mean their local congregation. People trust their local congregation more than they trust any other kind of organization, religious or otherwise. So the church is really at the center of their trust. And this is despite the fact that lots of people do not understand the church budget, not even a little bit. The bad news is that the trust that people have in the church, and in fact in any kind of institution, is going down. People trust the church because they're familiar with it, and as people attend the church less often, their familiarity is going down and their trust is going down. And some of the quotes that I heard in my research were along the lines of, how are you going to do overseas mission work when you can't even run your thing at home? A lot of people, not everyone, but a lot of people don't think their church is run efficiently. And I know that provokes a defensive reaction. It provokes a defensive reaction in me because I want to say, hey, but you have no idea how hard we work at. And then finish the sentence. You have no idea how hard we work at this. And that's the thing, is people don't have any idea. So the ugly part is when we hear quotes like, all this money, it's just for us. It's not going anywhere. I had a donor say that. They said, I know that's not true anymore, but at the time, that's how I read the budget. Another donor said, I had to scratch my head. I had no idea what it was saying. So people, the church budget to them is a black hole. They don't know where the money is going. And the biggest line items in our church budgets are typically staff and buildings. So those are things that we're going to address in particular as we go through. So there's the good and bad and the ugly. People trust us, but that trust is going down, and the ugly is the black hole aspect of church budgeting. So how are we going to find a story to tell? My favorite example congregation is Peach Blossom. If you've been here before, you may start to know Peach Blossom a little bit. Let's start with a limerick, shall we? There once was a church way back when, where the budget was done just by men. Best not to ask, just give us your cash. And the pastor resounded, all men. And that's how it used to be at Peach Blossom. But that's not how it is at Peach Blossom anymore. But things are changing there. Their attendance is going down. People are getting older. They have a mix of people at Peach Blossom. They have people who live on their smartphone and people who don't have a computer. So there's a really wide mix of people at Peach Blossom. One of the things that they might have in common at Peach Blossom, if you would ask people sort of in a quiet corner, is that they really, most of them, can't make heads or tails out of the church budget. This is about 2/3 of page 1 out of a 6-page church budget that I found on the internet. And if you look at it, you see 6 columns of numbers, a lot, and even another number to put for each row, a lot of asterisks, bold, and well, it doesn't really jump out at us and tell a story about what's going on in the church, does it? I spent a lot of time looking at all 6 pages, and I think I've started to guess what might be going on, but we really want to be at a better place than, well, if we really pour over it, we might be able to figure it out. We can do better than this. I'm not saying that we're going to get rid of our columns of numbers. We still need that, but we can tell the story of what we're doing in a different way. Here's an example, and you don't need to worry about copying this down, because in the handout that is on the Presbyterian Church of Canada website already, there's a handout that summarizes where all these references can be found and gives you an example of walking through this process. It's using this exact same examples as I'm using here. So this is a narrative budget from Hixson United Methodist Church in Tennessee. One of my tests to tell if something is a good example of easy to understand is, can I understand this without my reading glasses on? So if you just give this a quick scan, you'll see, well, you know what the church is, you know what's a budget. You can see that they've got a story to tell because they have a picture of their old church, a picture of their new church, some quotes from people that have been associated with the church. And you can see what their mission is and what, you know, they're offering help, hope, and healing through Jesus Christ. That's pretty clear. And they're moving forward in faith. That's the front page. On the second page, again, if you were to do this without the reading glasses, you can see, oh, they are concerned about worship, growth, a relationship with God. That's right in the center. Community outreach and service and missions. And then you can see some pictures that give a sense of their actual people doing these things. And then there's lots of words too, which support all the pictures. But you can, at a quick glance, you can get what they're about. And so that's a great example, I think, of you can get from a quick glance, you can get much more of an understanding of what this church is doing than you could at the previous example of the columns of numbers. So that's where we're headed. And you might be saying, well, that's great, Lori, but how exactly do we go about this? Well, we have this handy dandy 3-point arrow that you're going to see a couple of times. The first step that's outlined in purple is step 1. What is God doing among us? And I trust that God is, in fact, active at work in your church and in other churches. So let's start with that. And then we'll move on to looking at staff time and other kinds of spending. So let's start with, what is God doing at your congregation? Now, I imagine that we're all starting at this from different places. You might already have a mission statement or a vision statement or some congregation values to guide you as to what is the core essentials of how would you define yourselves as a church. And that's great. You can start with that when you're telling your story. But if you don't have that and you're starting from scratch, there's no reason why you can't borrow some words and some phrases from other churches. A lot of churches divide up their Christian practices into worship, Christian education, fellowship, and mission. So those are 4 categories that your church would probably understand. I borrowed wording from Judith Johnson. She's a United Church minister from Hamilton who's now retired, but it's from her that I learned narrative budgeting, and I'm so grateful to her. The categories that she uses are worshiping, learning, caring, and reaching out. You might be starting from scratch, but here are some places where you could borrow some words, or where you could start with your mission statement, your vision statement, or your values. There's several different starting points. Lots of ways to do this. I'm going to give you a couple of graphic examples of how you could come to see what your church is about. This sunflower is in response to a survey of what we're grateful for. And you can see that worship and community are at the center. And there's friends, pastors, spiritual guidance, teaching, caring, the fact that the congregation is intergenerational. Doing a simple survey is a great way of finding out, well, what is it at the heart of our congregation? What are we grateful for is usually what the most important things are. This is in response to another question, again, a short question of, how we spend our money at Peach Blossom reflect what our values are. And again, asking people for, how we spend our money reflect our values? And the answers to that will be interesting too, to say, well, this is what we do in our congregation, and this is what we think is important. This is what God is doing through us. I'll draw your attention to the top left box that says building and accessibility, because this congregation has said, hey, the stewardship of our building is really important. We take good care of our property because we engage the community here. And that's just another way of looking at it, and a good way of looking at it is thinking, what do we use this building for? How do we use this building? How do we engage our community with this building? It's not just a budget line item, it's a ministry tool. So once we've done some thinking and reflecting, maybe it's a survey, and maybe we already have some categories for how we would describe ourselves at our church, we're going to come up with some categories of what we do, how God is working among us at our church. The categories I'm going to use for this example are worship, and I think that's something that's going to be quite common for many of us, at least I hope so. Spiritual guidance and teaching, and of course there's lots of other words that you might use to describe the same thing. Community, caring, and mission. These are the 4 categories that we're going to use to tell our mission story in this example. Before I get any farther and moving along to step 2, I want to take a pause for questions.
So far, we don't have any in, other than people asking if it'll be recorded and the slides are available, and the answer to both of those are yes. We'll send links out afterwards, but you can also find them by searching for the Webinar Wednesday material on the website.
Right, and there's a handout that goes through an example of constructing a narrative budget, and it has these links, like the link to the Church from Tennessee, for instance.
So keep going, and if questions pop up, I'll let you know.
Okay. So we're on to, once we've got step 2, what is God doing among us, which admittedly is a big question, but an important question to pray about and discern. We move on to step 2, which is, okay, instead of just having our budget as a staff salary line, which is usually one of the larger lines, how can we get the staff time to reflect the different ways, different things that God is doing among us? So if you see this little orange chart here, I want to say that if you're math phobic, and you don't worry, because you can still do a narrative budget without numbers. I'm giving you the numbers, but when we get to step 3, I'll show you that even if you weren't able to work out numbers, that you can still have a narrative budget. So fear not. Just like all the angels say, fear not. Peach Blossom has a pastor and a secretary. And when the pastor and the secretary, or the admin assistant would be a better word, When they reflected on how they typically spend their time, the pastor spends about 60% of her time or his time on worship, and about 15% on spiritual guidance and teaching, about 15% on community caring, and 10% on mission. These don't have to, please no decimals. These are a way of showing typically what happens. It doesn't mean that 1 week is not going to be 80% on worship, or that, you know, things are going to vary, but typically this is about how things happen at Peach Blossom. The admin assistant typically spends about 75% of his time on worship, and then in other categories as I've shown here. And the reasons that that's important is to work out the time spent in these different Christian practices, as Judith calls them, is because once we have their time worked out in Christian practices, then we can look at the budget in a different way. And that's where the next slide is going. So this is the same categories of worship, spiritual guidance and teaching, community caring and mission. But what we've done is we've taken the pastor's salary and multiplied it out based on the time spent in each category. So if you look at the 42,000 square where the arrow is, if the pastor makes 70,000 or whatever, I just use numbers that multiply easily. So 60% of their time is spent in worship. So 60% of $70,000 is $42,000 in worship. And the secretary or admin assistant, that number is a little bit different because they spend more time on worship. But again, it's the same math that's involved. If they spend this amount of their time, then multiply that percentage of their time by their salary, and then you can see the money that we devote to staffing across these different categories. So this way, instead of having our staffing line just be a number of, well, we spend $100,000 on staffing, now it's, well, of the staffing, we spend $64,000 on worship, $12,000 on spiritual guidance, $16,500 in the community, and so on. So it's a way of translating that the money devoted to staffing across these different Christian practices. And I'm going to pause for another question. Again, the handout has this exact example, you write down to the little arrows and the multiplication so that you can look at this again.
No, I think we're doing good with questions. You're being very clear, Lori.
Okay.
We'll just remind people that the downloads are already up on the webinar Wednesday page if people want to check them out. And the recording will be up on the previous webinar page shortly after. Okay.
So now with our lovely arrow here, we've devoted some attention to answering the question, what is God doing among us? And then we've come up with different categories, or Christian practices is a better word. We've divided our time, the staff time, up amongst those different Christian practices so that we can look at their salaries in a different light. Now we're going to do that same kind of math with our spending. So at Peach Blossom, they got the church calendar out. And for this step, it's important to ask a lot of people because you might not realize all of the uses that the church building has. Of course, if you don't have a church building and you're renting space, this is going to be a little bit easier, and that's fine too. So at Peach Blossom, they reckon that about 40% of the church time is devoted to worship. Another 20% of the time to spiritual guidance and teaching. That would be Bible studies and Sunday school and prayer meetings. And then they looked at community caring and things that happen during the week and things that happen during the evening. And even when the church is used as a hub for another kind of community event, you might not think, oh, well, every November we do this. And, you know, remember to include those kind of events too, not just the weekly or monthly. Once you start making a list, it's often quite impressive how with the church building, how it serves the community. And mission, however.
Here's a question, Lori. If the church, what do you do for the days the church building's not in use? Do people ever consider that? Or do you just look at the overall days it's being used and times it's being used and then calculate it based on that?
I think that would be the simplest. I mean, we're not sending a rocket to Mars here. We don't want to use any decimals, but we want to get a general idea of how the church. I mean, if of the church. I would say yes. Of the how when the church is used, what is it used for?
So yes, use these numbers, base it on the amount of time used, and then look and see how much the time is and figure that out. That's a great idea.
So this next slide looks at the building use by Christian practice or category, right, in dollars. Now, don't get too hung up on the actual amounts. You're saying, what? $1,000 for insurance, that's all? $1,000 is just such a lovely number to multiply. That's why I chose it. So if you look at insurance and you think, okay, well, 40% of the time our building is used for worship. So 40% of our insurance, that's $400. We'll put that in the worship category. And so similarly for spiritual guidance or community caring, if 20% of our time of the church is used for spiritual guiding and teaching, that came out badly. If 20% of the time our church is used for spiritual guidance and teaching, then 20% of our insurance budget will go in that category too. That's where the $200 comes from. You just keep repeating that same math across the row. So then instead of having just a line that says we spend this on utilities or maintenance or whatever, those sums are going to go into different categories, different Christian practices, the same way that we've done with the salaries, exactly the same kind of math and the same approach. And again, we're not sending a rocket to Mars here. We don't want decimals or anything complicated. We want a general idea so that we can start to look at our church, and rather than just say, well, this is all overhead or this is just a black hole. No, we're actually doing something here, and let's show this in a different way. So this next slide is the columns of numbers again, and you were just saying, Lori, weren't you saying that people don't understand columns of numbers? And it's true. But we want to keep some summary so that I can show you an example of how this works out when you do chart it up this way, if you choose to. So if you look at the top, we have our budget, and then across the top we have our spiritual practices of worship and so forth. I'll just look at the top line, I think. So staffing, our annual budget is $100,000, and then we can see that $64,000 for worship, $12,000 for teaching, and so on. It's saying it's showing that this isn't just a black hole of staffing, and this is how God is working when we pay our staff. This is what happens. Similarly for custodial services. And then for some of the other expenses of our church, and again, I'm indebted to Judith Johnson for this example, which I modified quite a bit, but you would know that music, and you spend so much on music, well, that's mostly on worship, but it's partly for Bible study or whatever it is. You'll have an idea of how to divide up the different line items in your budget into these Christian practices or these categories. So then when you look at the bottom of the church budget, the very last line, $164,400, you can see that worship is the biggest, and then spiritual guidance and teaching, and then community caring is a substantial amount, and mission too. A mission that happens not just money that's spent elsewhere, but the mission that happens when you open your doors so that the Alcoholics Anonymous can meet there on a Wednesday. So both the far and the near.
So just for an example, Lori, if some churches use their facilities for concerts for the community, then their music might put another section in community caring. It just all depends what they're doing and how they're describing it.
Right, and I think that's an excellent example, and that's also a time to think, oh, right, a lot of people are coming through our doors because of the symphony or because of the choir, and then you start to think, oh, well, maybe we should be, how would we be welcoming these people more intentionally? So yeah, there's a lot of synergy that can happen when we start looking at things in a different way. That's a great example. So Peach Blossom spending by category is the next slide, and you can see that they spend 48% on worship, 16% on spiritual guidance and teaching, 16% on community caring, and 20% on mission. And of course, actual mileage will vary. This is a pretend congregation of Peach Blossoms, but you can see that if you gave $10 or $100 or $1,000 to Peach Blossom, you can start to see what would happen with that money, what it would be used for. And that's what we're aiming for, is what will happen, and how will God use this money once I give it to you? Any questions?
If anyone has a question on the phone and they want to unmute and ask, you can do it as well. Otherwise, people can type them in. I guess I'll say, Lori, we see that this is a great thing to do for stewardship committees, because when you're encouraging people to give to the church or what the church is doing, you don't ever want to say, oh, we want you to give and this will help pay for a salary of a minister or pay the salaries. It's more like, what's being done, what's being accomplished, what's the impact that's happening.
Exactly. And the good news is that
nobody ever says, oh, please give to the Cancer Society so we can pay our hydro bill and pay our researchers and do that. They say, oh, you should give because you're going to help cure cancer, or you're going to help care for people who are living with cancer, or you're going to help the bereaved who've been affected by cancer.
Yes, I see we're ready for the advanced course. This is excellent. Yes, exactly. What does the kingdom of God look like among you? That's the question.
Okay, there's not any more questions, so keep going.
Okay, so telling your church's mission story. I think this is my favorite part. And the good news, as I've said before, but it's worth saying again, is that you can still do this without doing the math. If dividing the expenses up or the staff time up is just something that you're not able to contemplate right now, as long as you can look at your church and its Christian practices and come up with different Christian practices, then you can still tell the stories, even though you might not have a percentage or a number attached to it. So as I said, fear not. If you don't have the math, you can still tell the stories. For instance, I'm quite certain that your churches worship together. And this is just one of those everyday miracles that we perhaps don't celebrate enough. We have the opportunity to gather together, praise God, and worship. And that is a story to tell and to rejoice in. And if you can have examples of people sharing how they have found strength and comfort in worship and prayer at your congregation, these are stories worth telling. For example, at Peach Blossom, they had 3 funerals in 2 months. That might not sound like a story, but of course it is. They mourned with those who mourned and laughed with those who laughed, and often it was at the same time. And it was a very significant community outreach, if you think about it, because lots of people who hadn't been at Peach Blossom before or not in a very long time came to Peach Blossom in those 2 months. So it was an opportunity to provide a lot of spiritual care to the community and, of course, to those families in particular. And at Peach Blossom, one of the members at funerals was for Mr. Alton, a long time member, much loved. And Mrs. Alton, his widow, shared with the congregation how much it meant to her, the support of the congregation during that time, how she really felt carried by that congregation and felt God's caring through the people at Peach Blossom. And that is such an important testimonial. That's when we worship together, this is what we do, and this is how it helps, and how people are literally held together by it. And so that story of Mrs. Alton was really important. That's when we contribute money and time and energy to Peach Blossom, these are the kind of real people and the real things that happen. And so the importance of a short testimonial or a long testimonial from a real person is huge, because that's the things that we can relate to. You might not understand columns of numbers, but everyone understood Mrs. Alton when she shared her story. At Peach Blossom, spiritual guidance and teaching is 16% of their church budget. And again, if you don't know what percentage that is, you can still tell stories. You can tell stories of the youth group. You can tell stories of the children's classes or what's new this year. Did you have an adult group? Did you have a ladies' Bible study? And there might be some stories of really long time faithfulness that you could tell too, or stories of something new. And not everyone would have been at the small group that looked at Romans or that gathered to pray for the community after something terrible had happened. So I'm certain that you have stories to tell. And again, a short testimonial from a real person is so important here. If someone doesn't wish to share their name, that's fine. It could be anonymous, and someone else could read it or share it on their behalf. And it gives us an idea of when we contribute, what's happening, what's going on at our congregation. Community caring is 16% of our budget. And there's so many examples of this that sometimes we can't even really think of what's happening. So when I meet with pastors and they say, well, I don't know what stories I have to tell. I say, well, what did you do on Tuesday? What did you do on Tuesday morning? And that's just because that's a specific thing. And then you can say, well, I got a call from somebody and they were just in a mess. Their son had just got out of prison, or their son, or whatever. But if you just think of, if you're overwhelmed by thinking what actually happens, then I encourage you to answer the question, well, what did you do on Tuesday? And there might be a story there. There frequently is, in fact. But for community caring at Peach Blossom, they looked at the church calendar and they talked to the church administrator, and then they thought about things too that happened annually at their church, about what goes on. So there's family groups using the church hall. They're involved in the food bank, and they'd almost forgotten about that because they've been doing it for so long. And then they thought about the community choir that they have sometimes. And, oh yeah, well, there's the toddlers that runs during the school year, and the alcoholic, there's lots and lots of examples. So the custodian really might be the best person to know what all happens in the church and how the community is involved. And again, I keep repeating this slide because it's so important. A short testimonial from a real person makes all the difference here. All right. And it could be, and again, if you need to protect confidentiality, of course, it could be the pastor saying, I'm so privileged that you support me to be your pastor, because on Tuesday morning I got this phone call and I was able to talk to this person for half an hour, and we really helped someone who was in distress. And thank you. Thank you that I'm able to be your pastor and that you support me, and that you'll never meet this person, but we helped somebody in the community this week. Mission is 20% of our church budget at Peach Blossom. And some of the mission workers are often the best storytellers, and I would urge us to follow their example, because they know that we are not where they are, so they send us pictures and letters and make videos and Skype with us. And so I would definitely encourage you to imitate mission workers for their storytelling abilities. This churches have lots of stories to tell here, of course. Maybe it's someone from your own congregation who's in service somewhere else or locally. There might be a mission committee that supports mission workers through letters and prayers and financial support, and those are all stories to tell. Think of what your congregation does through your denomination, and Karen and Janice would be able to help you connect with some stories here too. What is when you give money beyond yourselves to the larger denominational work? What's happening? And what's happening right in your own backyard too? So there's lots of good stories to tell. And again, I can't stress enough that a short testimonial from a real person makes all the difference. And then it doesn't become abstract, it's something real. So I'd love to hear examples of how your congregation tells these stories. Here are some of the ones that I can think of. Having a party, getting different people together to tell stories about Christian education or mission or the community or how worship affected them. All these different stories that we have to tell. Wouldn't that be a great tea party or cupcakes? I guess, because I'm Mennonite, I'm obsessed with food. I guess you could have this without food. That would be fine too. You could gather some photos and have a show and tell. My own congregation does this at our annual meeting. Before we talk about the budget, we have a slideshow and show the pictures that have happened during the past year. And I like it. It shows us why we're here and reminds us of all the people that we care about and things that have happened. So I like that idea. Could also sing some songs. There's great songs about all of these things, about worship and missions and spiritual guidance and caring for the community. And can you imagine maybe before the offering having a song saying, you know, so much of our budget goes to Christian education, and we just wanted to sing this song and be grateful that we have this opportunity to help each other grow in the faith. Lots of ways to do this. You can make a narrative budget in print form. Of course, that's the sort of the basic document that I'm referring to in this workshop, but there's lots of ways you could do that. Starting in print, you could make it into a video. You could put it on your website. Lots of ways. People are very creative, and it becomes a fun thing instead of a must-do thing. Okay, I'm going to go back to this example from Hickson United Methodist Church. And you probably can't read the little yellow circle there, but I've been saying over and over a short testimonial from a real person. And that's what they've got here. They have a testimonial from Annabelle Hill, a 5th grader. From kindergarten to now, I've grown in my faith so much. I went from begging not to go to church to praying every night. It's sort of my second home. That, my friends, is a powerful testimonial from an 11-year-old. And yeah, it doesn't get better than that. That would be a great kind of testimonial to have in your church budget. I think everyone can understand that they want people to grow in faith as a result of attending your congregation. So that's why that example is circled. It's simple and it's powerful and it's real.
Hey, Lori, there's Arlene has written on the chat. She says that we've changed our AGM, the annual general meeting, to Awesome Grace Moments. And each ministry group does a creative presentation in songs, skits, games. They even did a Jeopardy last year for the temporal, like their building maintenance utilities, and they also have food. So they do the food, they do the fun presentation, and they have kids participate in the skit. That sounds like a great AGM. I'd come to that.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. Awesome, great grace moments. You can't see it on the web. I don't have my webcam, but I am smiling. That is terrific. And thank you for sharing that story. Exactly. And I'm sure that people, once they've been to your party, are excited about what God is doing at your church. And that's 100% of the point. Thank you for sharing that. Awesome grace moments. That would make the Awesome Grace Moments would make a lovely brochure too. It's going on to this one where they talk about worship, community, and service, the core of what they do at the church. And then they have some examples. And then across the bottom they have the money. Now they don't use the same categories in the white part and in the brown part. So that's not ideal, but still you get the idea of what's going on in their church. And that's what we want to do too, is tell those awesome grace moment stories. So these links are all on the handout. Links to Judith Johnson's work. Her work isn't terribly visual because it's a little bit older, but still it's a great guide to narrative budgeting. Charityinfo.ca link has unfortunately some dead links in it, but it's still a really good read, and it's written from a secular perspective of how to tell your budget story. Let me guess, I guess that's the right. There's the United Methodist Church link to that example that I've used a couple of times, and also a link to a narrative budget from Knox Presbyterian in Calgary. Now, if you have an example to add to this list, please let Janice know about it. We would love to see it and to be able to share those stories with a wider church. If you'd like to be involved, of course, in a generosity assessment, which could have narrative budgeting as the next step, you'd also talk to Janice and Karen. And there is a generosity assessment webinar posted already. That's from, I think, last week.
Here's a question, Lori. If you choose, this comes from somebody online. If you choose a heading in the breakdown such as music, but somebody who donates has no interest in music, how do you handle it? Because there's no way to separate their offering.
It's the general work of the church. It's, you know, your money is going to that, into one big pot, and then the church as a whole decides how to spend it. So you don't have to worry about I mean, someone could make a designated contribution to music, I suppose, if they chose to, but you don't have to worry that about that level of granularity. That it's that designated giving thing is actually an interesting question, because once we start putting strings on it, then we don't trust the church as much. So I would want to encourage us to say this is the kind of great things that happen when that God is doing among us. And when you contribute, we're prayerfully discerning as congregational leaders how to do that, how to spend that money. And if there's trust, then you don't have to have. Then you can encourage people just to continue to give to the general fund rather than designate.
And I think part of the idea is that really you're talking about worship. So when you're doing your narrative budget, you're putting them into the more broad categories and not being as specific as music. There'll be
Right.
always people who want to see, oh, what are the different lines and where they can go. But most people will be interested in what's the church accomplishing, what's it doing, and I think it's about answering the question, what's God doing with the offerings and tithes that I'm giving every year? So, or every week. So it's sort of like, what's happening? And yeah, you can articulate that in the different things. It'll depend and reflect the church community. Now here's another question from Emma. She says, wants to know if there's a way to phase this in.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's already pretty clear that it's a pretty creative bunch. So there's no reason why you couldn't start by celebrating all different kinds of moments without categorizing them. Or you could share stories about different Christian practices without having any numbers. And then you could work towards dividing your budget up into those Christian practices. But you could start telling the stories without having the numbers.
I'd also say that it's interesting because sometimes the process of creating the narrative budget just makes you think of things that might not occur to you before. So it's when you start to think about your time and then you have to begin to make the list of how all the time is allocated that you go, oh, this is really what we're doing. It can be as much an encouragement to the ministers and the leaders in the church because they've never had something to sort of back up and be more concrete behind it. But if you say, actually, we've gone through and analyzed the time and analyzed the money and see where it's going and how it's connected, it just sort of adds a little bit more weight, especially for people who are like, oh, is this really factual? Is it, do we really know how much we're spending? But at least you put some intentional thought behind it. You're more confident in answering that. Now, we've got just a comment, and I was just thinking this could be another webinar subject, the question of designated gifts. And somebody comments that their congregation members can designate where their funds go to, and some choose general giving, which is where the management team can use it as needed, and others designate to specific areas. So it is it's a long conversation and interesting because we know that people will give to more specific areas, but you also need the support of the general fund. And when we do Stewards by Design, we talk about opening different giving doors. So one is the offering plate and the people who give to support everything. And then the other is having special programs or special offerings to support specific things. So there's definitely a way designated giving can complement your ongoing offerings. But I think the point of this one is to talk about how do we articulate what the general offerings are doing overall, as opposed to saying, oh, well, it pays the staffing salaries, it pays the fees and the hydro and all of that. Well, what's it accomplishing? What's the impact it's having?
Yeah, exactly. So we don't want to have the black hole box, like this is the black hole fund where we just kind of, where we're not exactly sure what's going on. And then this is the other fund where interesting and wonderful things happen, because interesting and wonderful things happen in both. So we want, yes, and Karen's exactly right. The point here is to tell the stories of what's happening with our general fund.
Okay, Bernadette asked, okay, there's two questions. So Tracy asks, this is a bit off topic, but I heard some churches are going to a one-line offering envelope. We usually have 3 lines, one for general, one for Presbyterian sharing, and one blank for special items. Has anyone gone to a one-line envelope? I don't know that if people will have an answer. I can tell you that I've been in churches across Canada, and some have a one-line envelope, and others will have the 3, like you say. It's again tied to the designated giving, that some people may give more if they can say exactly where it'll go to. So if you go to one line on the envelope, you might have special offerings or special times when you say, here's a chance for you to give specifically to do this. And usually you'll find people are really scared that it'll take away from the general fund, but usually you find it adds to the general fund, and overall the funds are provided for the ministry that you want to do. But it's we'll work on a webinar discussion just about that. Bernadette asks, would you put the narrative budget in the AGM 50-page handout at the AGM meeting?
I don't know. Do people read the 50-page handout? That would probably answer the question. Yeah, I mean, I think specific congregations will be the best judges of their context, right? So if you think people will look at it in that document, then absolutely. If you think it'll be, that it'll be buried, then maybe there's some other way to do it. Maybe it really needs to be a presentation with people, or a video, or a skit.
I think it's a great way to organize your 50-page AGM, and that actually, you can think of that as the narrative budget and get the stories out of it. But then when you're articulating it and you're having your meeting, think about fun ways that you can tell that story. I love the skits, songs, a slideshow, so that when people come, they're not getting really tied up in all the exact details. There'll always be some people who want to know what the exact details are. But you'll find most people want to know what the broad strokes are and what the church is accomplishing, where they're going, all of that. Just a comment from Kathy, who's planning to phase the great ideas from this webinar by using the cover pages of their printed report as the narrative story, rather than just the name of the church in AGM 2017. Within the inside pages will be the financial reports. I think that's a great idea, Kathy. And Bernadette did affirm that, yes, people do read their 50 pages.
Bless them.
Arlene wanted to note that they have separated the budget meeting to have it in November, and then they do the awesome grace moments in March. Gwen comments that she talked to somebody who used the narrative budget, and the few weeks before their AGM narrative budget, they held 30-minute meetings on each Sunday after worship on each of the various sections. That's a good idea as well.
I think that's my favorite part of gathering people together either in a room or in a webinar, is just hearing all the stories of how different churches have done this. That reminds me actually of a story that I heard that you could do on your narrative budget as well, is what would happen if we got more than the budget? What's our vision if we got an extra $500,000? What would we do? So that's a great, that just occurred to me now, and that's a great question to put out there. Not a question, but something to put out there as well. And like, okay, because our vision is probably bigger than our budget. It should be. So what would happen? What would we do if we got even more funds? What would we do with that?
Great. Well, so far I don't see any more questions that are popping up. Lori, do you have more that you want to say?
Well, I definitely want to say thank you to people for sharing all their examples and stories, and to encourage everyone that no matter what age or stage or size of your church, that you do have stories to tell of what God is doing among you. I'll put up a slide, and it's also on my handout, that if you did want to read more about the work that I've done, that there's ways to do that. And also to encourage people to talk to Karen and talk to the two of you, because you're there to help. And there's different ways, the generosity assessment being only one, different means and resources that are available to help people in stewardship. You don't have to figure this all out on your own. So yeah, I think that's I'm happy to take more questions if there are some.
No, I see some thanks being expressed on the chat, and so we'll say thank you again, once again, Lori, for giving us something to think about and chew on. And we look forward to seeing in the coming years the examples of narrative budgets that congregations come up with. Really, congregations do like to get inspired by your ideas. So if you share them with us, we'll post them and share them around. The handout, there's a handout right now and the slides already online. The recording will be posted in the next day or so. And if you go to the Webinar Wednesday section in the Presbyterian.ca, you'll find the link to the previous recordings, and you'll find the recordings of the webinars that have already happened.
Oh, and we should put a plug in for upcoming webinars. In 2 weeks, is it digital giving?
Digital giving is happening in 2 weeks.
Yes, and then at the beginning of December, there's a webinar about saying thank you. So more to come.
There is a question about if people are wanting to do this presentation for their sessions or stuff, is your material licensed? Are they allowed to adapt it to their use? Can they copy some of your language or your slides, Lori? How do you feel about that?
Huh. I don't have a good answer to that question. I think I'm going to have to I can't pull a good answer out of my hat, out of my top of my head right now. I would encourage you to look at some of the references that, of course, I mean, I didn't invent the topic of narrative budgeting, so of course you're welcome to use that. I would encourage you to look at Judith's stuff and look at some of those references. Look at the, you can certainly, of course, use the example that's posted there. So I think with pulling those references together that you could, and the handout that I have, which you're welcome to use, I think you would be able to explain this pretty well.
Great. Yeah, there are lots of good options online as well. And I think if you are using some of the ideas from Lori, you can also say that you got the idea from Lori on the webinar and give credit there. That's helpful.
Or you could watch this webinar.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.